It is 1066 and England is in crisis. The king, Harold Godwinson, expecting an invasion from the south, waits for the enemy to cross the English Channel from Normandy. Then, a vast fleet of 300 ships is sighted off the coast, led by one of the most feared warriors in Europe. However, this army has not come from Normandy, but Norway. The dreaded Vikings have come again, and their leader intends to seize the throne. His name? Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking. The man known to history as Harald Sigurdsson, Harald Hardrada, or King Harold III of Norway, was born around 1015 or 1016 in Ringerike, north of Oslo in southern Norway. His father was King Sigurdsson, a relatively minor ruler of Ringerike in the region of Buskerud, in the Norwegian uplands. He is believed to have been a great-grandson of King Harald Fairhair, the first ruler of a united kingdom of Norway, who is believed to have ruled for several decades in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. Thus, young Harald was born as the great-great-grandson of the first ruler of a unified Norwegian kingdom. Harald's mother was Åsta Gudbrandsdatter. She had married Sigurdsson shortly after the death of her first husband, Harald Grenske, who was a ruler of the Vestfold region of Norway. Grenske was murdered as he slept in his foster sister, Sigrid the Haughty's home, who he had hoped to marry to benefit from her wealthy estate. That first marriage of Åsta's had produced a son, Olaf, who became King Olaf II of Norway at around 20 years of age in 1015, right around the time Harald was born. Her second marriage to Sigurdsson, Harold's father, produced numerous children before Harald himself was born, and in addition to having Olaf as a half-brother, Harald had several older full biological siblings, specifically 3 brothers, Guttorm, Halfdan, and Ingerid, and a sister named Gunhild. In recent years, the paternal lineage of Harald's father has been questioned by some historians, as it is thought that his family tree may have been altered sometime after his death to further legitimize his descendants' claims to the Norwegian throne, which was a practice that was not uncommon at the time. According to the Icelandic sagas, both Harald and his half-brother Olaf were descended from the supposed first king of Norway, King Harald I, or Harald Fairhair, and it is said that Harald's great-grandfather was Sigurd Risa, who was the son of Fairhair. However, as no definitive evidence exists to verify the accuracy of many of the Norse sagas, the accuracy of Hardrada's family lineage is still debated. The sources available for Harald Hardrada's life are fragmentary. Some parts of his life are reasonably well documented, but others are much less so, while the sources available also provide very different kinds of information depending on where and when they were written. Unfortunately, Very little recorded evidence concerning his early life is extant. One of the most important sources for his adult life are the writings of Snorri Sturluson, the greatest Norse poet and chronicler of medieval times, who lived in Iceland in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. He composed a work called the Heimskringla, which transliterates as the Circle of the World. It was a history of the Norse kings of Norway and Sweden, and Harald features prominently in some sections. For his time in Eastern Europe and at Constantinople, the Russian Primary Chronicle, a set of annalistic chronicles of the history of Kievan Rus and other Norse settlements in Eastern Europe, is useful, while for his time involved in English politics, both the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the Bayer Tapestry are invaluable. A number of other historians and chroniclers mentioned him or discussed Harald somewhat peripherally in their work, notably Adam of Bremen, a near contemporary of Harald's from the city of Bremen in northern Germany, who composed an ecclesiastical history of the regions straddling northern Germany and Denmark in the late 11th century. Adam's life substantially overlapped with that of Hardrada, whom he referred to as the Thunderbolt of the North. Little verifiable information exists with which to reconstruct the details of Harald's childhood. He was described by the 13th century Icelandic poet Snorri Sturluson as being larger and taller than other men from a young age, with light-coloured hair, a substantial beard and moustache. The Vikings, or Norse people of Scandinavia at the height of the Norse migrations in the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries, did not have a system of formal education. Instead, children like Harald of the aristocracy and local elites were educated by learned individuals at the courts of their rulers. From these men, Harald would have learned about the legendary exploits of the Norse warriors and explorers of Norway, and also the more historically affirmed raiding parties and wars of settlement which had taken place to regions like England, northern France, and down the great rivers of Eastern Europe, the Don, Dnieper, and Volga, since the 790s AD. Harald would have grown up in a Viking longhouse, though from a young age he would have spent some time at sea, travelling in a Viking longboat and training to become a Norse warrior himself. He was largely raised as a Christian, his father having converted to the religion during his lifetime, though this was still a mixed society, one in which some people were Christians and others were polytheistic worshippers of the Old Norse gods such as Odin and Thor. Like his half-brother Olaf, Harald would continue the Viking tradition of leaving his homeland in order to seek fame and fortune across the high seas. Harald's life must be viewed within the context of wider Norse or Viking history between the 8th and 11th centuries. The Norse people had begun expanding out of Scandinavia in the final decades of the 8th century AD. At first, bands of Norse warriors from Norway and Denmark simply raided places like England, Scotland, Ireland and northern France, and brought home booty and slaves to Scandinavia, while the Swedes were primarily engaging in similar activity by sailing down the great rivers of Eastern Europe, the Volga, Don, and Dnieper, to strike at Byzantine and even Arab settlements on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the Black Sea, and the Caspian Sea. In the second half of the 9th century, these raids evolved into efforts by Norse warlords to conquer territory and establish their own kingdoms. Thus, by the dawn of the 10th century, there were formidable Danish and Norwegian warlords who had established themselves as rulers of regions like Dublin in Ireland, Northumbria and East Anglia in England, Normandy in northern France, and cities like Novgorod, Staraya Ladega, and Kiev in Eastern Europe. The Norse had even laid siege to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, modern-day Istanbul, on several occasions. Eventually, rather than continue to be threatened by the Norse raiders operating out of Kiev, the Byzantine rulers had even resorted to hiring the Norse warrior bands. They became known as Varangians at Constantinople, a Greek-derived term which transliterates to pledged sword companion. Meanwhile, in England, the Anglo-Saxon rulers of the Kingdom of Wessex had largely succeeded in overcoming the Danish invaders in the late 9th and early 10th centuries and established a united Kingdom of England, but by then tens of thousands of Danes and Norwegians had settled across England, creating a hybrid Anglo-Saxon and Norse community. While Anglo-Saxon rulers prevailed there for the time being, there were many Danish nobles who had moved to support Norse claimants to rule England from Denmark and Norway in time to come, if the opportunity presented itself. Harald's life would play out in all of these spheres of Norse activity: Scandinavia, Britain, and Eastern Europe. His earliest political and military activity occurred in Norway. In the early 9th century AD, at the beginning of the Viking Age, Norway had been made up of a number of small regional kingdoms ruled by local warlords, but by the end of the 9th century, all of the western coastal regions of Scandinavia had been unified under the rule of Harald and Olaf's ancestor, King Harold I, or Harald Fairhair. However, after his death in 933 AD, the territory fractured again into smaller territories and kingdoms controlled by jarls, or nobles under Fairhair's descendants. Olav Tryggvason broadly succeeded in reuniting Norway under his sole rule in the late 10th century, not long before Harald was born. He also did much to convert his subjects to Christianity. Then, in the year 1000, Tryggvason was killed by the forces of his arch-enemy and brother-in-law, the pagan king of Denmark, Sweyn Forkbeard, in the Battle of Fulford, after which Forkbeard united the kingdoms of Denmark and Norway, installing several vassal jarls to rule over different parts of his newly acquired Norwegian kingdom. Forkbeard ultimately died in 1014 in Lincolnshire in England after invading that country and dethroning its Anglo-Saxon ruler, King Ethelred the Unready. Thus, At the time Harald was born, Denmark, Norway and England were entering into a period of political and military flux, with a swift turnover of Norse rulers in Denmark and Norway, and Anglo-Saxon rule in England yet again being threatened by would-be Norse rulers from Scandinavia. After this, Forkbeard's eldest son, Harald II, became King of Denmark, whilst his younger son, Knut, was proclaimed King of England. That is, until he was driven out of the position when Ethelred returned from exile in Normandy at the request of the English nobles. Then, after the deaths of both Ethelred and his son Edmund Ironside in 1016, Knut became the undisputed King of England once more. At the end of the 1010s, he also succeeded his brother as King of Denmark, while he would later briefly rule Norway from 1029 onwards, and even some small parts of Sweden, Pomerania, and Schleswig, all of which earned him the title of Knut the Great, with historians often terming his realms a North Sea empire. All of this had implications for young Harald Hardrada, though in ways which nobody could have foreseen as these events were playing out in the early 11th century. By the time of Sweyn Forkbeard's death in 1014, Harald's older half-brother Olaf was around 19 years of age and was already a seasoned campaigner, one who had embarked on many travels and campaigns around the Baltic Sea and to both England and Normandy, from where he even aided Ethelred the Unready, a development which emphasizes how enmeshed Norse and Anglo-Saxon politics had become by the early 11th century. It was not simply a matter of Anglo-Saxons fighting against Norse invaders. Both groups lived amongst one another and allied with one another in a North Sea world that had experienced coming and goings between Scandinavia and Western Europe for over 2 centuries. These actions of Olaf were part of his quest to claim the throne from King Knut by taking the city of London. After this, in 1015, Olaf decided to return to Norway and attempted to reclaim what he saw as his ancestral birthright, the Norwegian throne, no doubt making use of the wealth he had accumulated on his travels. He left Normandy, where he had converted to Christianity, and landed in his homeland. There, he met with the success that had eluded him in England, declaring himself to be monarch and gaining the support of the 5 petty kings of Norway. He defeated the Jarls of Larder that opposed him at the Battle of Nesjar in 1016 and would rule as King of Norway for over a decade as a result. Much of Olaf's success in claiming the throne of Norway was owing to his main rival, King Knut, being otherwise indisposed while he was subduing England. However, almost a decade later, in 1026, the Danish king amassed a powerful army, including Danish and English housecarls, and mounted an invasion of mainland Scandinavia. This initial foray against Olaf culminated in the Battle of Helgeå, or the Battle of the Holy River, in the Skåne region of southern Sweden, in 1026. In this, Olaf and his Swedish ally Anund Jakob were narrowly defeated by Canute and his joint Danish and English army. It was the beginning of a campaign in which Canute would ultimately defeat Olaf and seize the throne of Norway in 1029, a move which forced Olaf to flee Norway for the Norse state of Kievan Rus in Eastern Europe. The following year, after he returned to Sweden and the death at sea of Canute's regent or governor in Norway, Hakon Eriksson, Jarl of Lade, Olaf attempted to retake the throne of Norway. It was at this juncture that we first hear of his half-brother, Harald Hardrada, entering into the military affairs and politics of Scandinavia. By that time, Harald was about 15 years of age, a young man by medieval standards. Harald is believed to have brought 600 men to Olaf's banner, marching through Sweden towards Trondheim in northern Norway, where, on the 29th of July 1030, Olaf, Harald and their other allies amongst the Norwegians and Swedes met a larger Norwegian force of nobles loyal to King Canute at the Battle of Stiklestad. After fierce fighting, Olaf incurred 2 wounds to his neck and knee, and whilst leaning on a rock, no doubt in a state of exhaustion and physical collapse, a spear was thrust up and under his chainmail coat and into his torso. Then another warrior dispatched him with a sword thrust to the throat. The former king of Norway's army was overwhelmed as the battle progressed, but nonetheless, even as they fled the field, Harald and Olaf's men retrieved Olaf's body and managed to bury him nearby, although the exact location of the site remains a mystery to this day. Afterwards, stories quickly developed about alleged miracles Olaf had performed during his lifetime, and his conversion to Christianity while in Normandy, and his efforts to convert the people of Norway when king there were lionized, leading to his canonization as Saint Olaf by Pope Alexander III in 1164. More immediately, with his death in battle, Olaf's claim to the throne of Norway fell to his half-brother Harald. After the defeat at the Battle of Stiklestad, Harald, who had fought bravely by Olaf's side, found refuge with a small band of followers on a remote farm in order to heal his wounds and plan his next moves. After recovering, he travelled over the Norwegian border and across the Swedish mountains and forests before taking ship over the Baltic Sea and down the riverine routeways of Eastern Europe to the centre of Norse habitation in the region, Kievan Rus, the capital of which was the city of Kiev, capital of modern-day Ukraine. At the time, the city controlled extensive territory and was ruled by King Yaroslav I, otherwise known as Yaroslav the Wise, who was both Prince of Novgorod in what is now Western Russia and Grand Prince of Kiev. Yaroslav's wife was Ingigerd Olafsdotter. While he was king of Norway, Harald's half-brother Olaf had previously organized a marriage alliance with the Swedish king, Olaf Skjøtkunen, through which it had been intended that he would marry Ingigerd. That marriage proposal eventually collapsed, and she went on to marry Yaroslav. But Olaf had subsequently married Ingegard's sister, Astrid Olafsdotter. This meant that Harald was circuitously related to Yaroslav through his half-brother's marriage to the Kievan ruler's sister-in-law. Therefore, Harald obtained a warm reception in Kiev when he arrived there after fleeing from Scandinavia, and many years later, the alliance would be further cemented by Harold's marriage to Yaroslav's daughter, Lady Elisiv of Kiev. Throughout 1031, after his arrival there, Harald ingratiated himself within Yaroslav's court, becoming a military captain and also proposing marriage to Lady Elisiv for the first time. She was only a child of 6 or 7 years at the time, and the marriage would not have happened for many years to come. It was simply a request to be formally promised as a means of cementing an alliance between Yaroslav and Harald, the latter of whom, it must be remembered, was still only around 16 years of age or so at the time. In any event, the offer was initially rejected by Yaroslav, who did not consider Harald to be wealthy enough to provide a substantial mundra, or bride price, for the hand of a daughter of one of the most powerful lords of Europe at the time, while Harald's prospects of returning to Scandinavia and claiming the throne of Norway one day were also considered limited at the time. Yaroslav's refusal of the marriage convinced Harald that he needed to find fame and fortune if he was to ever reclaim what he perceived as his birthright back in Norway, and so, in the years that followed, he began campaigning with the Kievan Rus around Eastern Europe in their campaigns against the Poles to the west and various Asiatic groups amongst the Kuman-Kipchak Confederacy that lay to the east along the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Soon, though, his eyes turned to the city which the Rus knew as Miklagård, meaning the Great City. Miklagård was the Norse name for Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the successor state to the Roman Empire in the eastern Mediterranean. We know it as the city of Istanbul today. The Norse name for it was apt. Constantinople was indeed a great city, the largest in Europe throughout the early Middle Ages and rivaled only in the wider region by Baghdad, the capital of the Arab Caliphate. Early in their migrations down the rivers of Eastern Europe, the pagan Norse warriors from the north had been the enemies of the Byzantine Empire, first laying siege to Constantinople in 860 AD and again in 907 AD, though both of these attacks failed to breach the great walls of the Byzantine capital, which had also staved off attacks by the Arabs over the centuries and which many people considered to be impenetrable. Since the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, the Norse or Rus of Eastern Europe, many of whom were converting to Christianity by the time Basil became emperor in 976 AD, had been employed as an elite bodyguard and military unit within the Byzantine armies. There, as we have seen, they became known as the Varangian Guard, Varangian meaning something akin to pledged sword companion, so basically being a way of calling them Norse or Rus mercenaries. In Constantinople, the Varangians became an important element during Basil's long reign of nearly half a century, gaining a reputation as fierce warriors in the Byzantines' wars with the Arabs and Turks that threatened their eastern frontier. It was surely with the goal of attaining such a revered status himself that Harald decided to leave Kiev around 1033 with Yaroslav's blessing and accompanied by his band of about 500 followers to travel southwards to Constantinople. There, he entered the service of the Byzantine government during a period of rapid turnovers of monarchs that saw 6 rulers in less than 2 decades following the end of the long reign of Emperor Basil II. Harold would have faced competition from the leaders of other bands of Norse warriors in the Byzantine capital, but he soon advanced into the Varangian Guards as he was commissioned in 1034 or 1035 by Emperor Michael IV, who had himself only just become ruler of Byzantium. Over the next years, Harold and his men would serve in a number of campaigns of ever-increasing importance. Early on in his time as a Varangian commander, he was seemingly charged with tackling piratical activities in the eastern Mediterranean and freeing up the shipping routes leading to Constantinople from the Aegean Sea. However, over time, as we will see, he was given ever greater responsibilities and would soon be at the forefront of the Byzantines' wars with the Arabs in the Middle East. Whilst Harald was settling into his new life in the East, in 1035, King Canute died to the west. Of what is unclear, though it was not violently, although he was only around 40 years of age. Upon his death, and with the support of the King of Sweden and the Norwegian nobility, Harald's 11-year-old half-nephew, Magnus, the illegitimate son of Olaf II and his wife Astrid's English slave, Alfhild, became Magnus I of Norway, whilst King Canute's son, Harthacnut, became the King of Denmark. However, even though the Danes had largely been responsible for his father's demise, Magnus, acting on the advice of his counsellors, chose not to go to war against the Danish king, earning him the pseudonym of Magnus the Good in return for choosing peace over war. But in contrast to Magnus, Harthacnut soon rekindled his hopes of ruling over Norway as his father had. To that end, in 1040, war broke out between the kingdoms of Denmark and Norway. It was short-lived, as the nobles of both realms soon convinced their rival kings to meet for peace talks. At this conference, the two rivals agreed that the lands of the first one of them to pass away would go to the other. Luckily for Magnus, just 2 years later, Harthacnut died in England, meaning that Magnus became King of Denmark in 1042, uniting it to the throne of Norway once again. Hence, while Harald was away in the east serving as one of the leaders of the Varangian Guard, his half-nephew rose to the throne as ruler of both Norway and Denmark. Away to the east, by around 1040, even before Magnus acquired the crown of Denmark, his uncle Harald had proved himself to be such an extremely able and feared warrior that, according to Snorri Sturluson, writing 2 centuries later, he was considered the leader of all the Varangians in Byzantine employ. By this time, he had campaigned in the Byzantine armies in what was then known as Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, forcing back the Arabs to the river Euphrates in eastern Turkey and northern Iraq. He also took part in the capture of numerous Arab forts and settlements in the process. According to many accounts, Harald was pivotal in a Byzantine expedition which recaptured previously lost lands in Palestine with relative ease, quote, without fire nor by the sword, and, allegedly, oversaw the signing of a peace treaty between the Byzantines and the Muslim Fatimid Caliph, in which Christians were allowed to travel to Jerusalem. Still, since the journey was dangerous, Harald and his Varangians escorted pilgrims to the Holy City, where they no doubt visited the holy shrines and may have even helped to restore the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was built around the cave where Christ was said to have been entombed and then have risen from the dead. During these lengthy campaigns, Harald amassed a great personal fortune from plundering the cities and towns of the Arabs. He had also acquired a great following of Norse warriors and a substantial fleet, with which he even campaigned with the Byzantines west to Sicily, an island which for 2 centuries had been controlled by the Muslim Berbers and Arabs of North Africa and ruled as the Emirate of Sicily, but which by the mid-11th century was experiencing incursions by bands of Norman warriors, ultimately of Norse origin, who had settled in southern Italy and were often allied with the Byzantines in trying to fully oust the Muslims from the southern Italian island. It was during this latter Sicilian campaign that Harald marked himself out as an exceptional military commander. On one occasion, he and his comrade, the Norman mercenary William Iron Arm, faced difficulty in breaching the walls of a Muslim stronghold. However, the invaders overcame the fortifications by using a highly novel method of siege warfare. They first attached wax and sulphur on splintered pieces of wood to the back of small birds, which, when released over the stronghold, instinctively sought sanctuary underneath the roofs within the castle's walls. With sulphur now released over the walls, the Normans, Byzantines, and Varangians unleashed flammable arrows into the stronghold, which then quickly ignited fires wherever they struck the sulphur. Despite Harald's plundering expeditions, it is written that he was also merciful, sparing those who had surrendered. Yet, by March 1041, a Norman revolt in opposition to the Byzantine domination of southern Italy culminated in the Battle of Olivento. At this, the Normans, led by Harald's former ally, William Iron Arm, defeated the Byzantines, making the confrontation the first major Norman success against the Byzantines in the battle for control over Italy. the fighting in Italy continued, with Harold fighting at confrontations such as the Battle of Montemaggiore in May of 1041, where the Varangians once again faced the Normans, the latter of which were now leaving behind their ancient roots as a Norse people and were becoming the most skilled tactical users of cavalry in Europe. Shortly afterwards, Harald and the Varangian Guard were recalled from Italy to fight the Bulgars at the Battle of Ostrovo in the Balkans. Then, after Harald and his fellow guardsmen had returned to Constantinople, his patron, Emperor Michael IV, died in December 1041. He was replaced by his adopted son, Michael V. However, after ascending to the throne, Michael had Harald imprisoned on a charge of defrauding the imperial treasury. There is no way of knowing if Harald was truly guilty of this crime or not, and other accounts state that Harald was imprisoned because he had defiled a Byzantine noblewoman or for murder. Whatever the reason really was for his imprisonment, it had placed Harald's position in Constantinople in jeopardy after 6 or 7 years of great success in service to the Byzantine Empire. Harald's fate now became entwined with the complex dynastic politics and machinations of the Byzantine court. It was not just Harald that Emperor Michael had imprisoned at this time. He had banished his stepmother Zoe and was becoming a paranoid ruler convinced that plotters were attempting to poison him. His actions proved unpopular with the people of Constantinople, who then rose up in revolt against Michael and deposed him. They then installed Zoe and her sister Theodora as co-rulers. But after a brief 2-month reign, Zoe married Constantine IX of Monomachos, making him the new co-emperor alongside Theodora and herself, whilst the dethroned Michael was blinded, castrated, and sent to a monastery. In the midst of all of this, Harald had been set free, and it was possibly at his hands that the deposed Emperor Michael suffered his grisly fate. By the time of his release from captivity, Harald was around 27 or 28 years of age and was evidently becoming restless to return north to either Kiev or even his homeland, having no doubt learned by this time of developments there where his half-nephew had become King of Norway and would soon claim the Danish throne too. He made his wishes known, but his plan was opposed by Empress Zoe, who was unhappy about losing the service of Harald and his Varangians, many of which would no doubt leave with him if he headed back to Kiev. Yet Harald could not be dissuaded, and despite the Empress forbidding him to leave her service, one evening he, along with a small number of followers, cast off from the harbour of Constantinople on 2 small ships. Whilst entering the Bosporus Strait that connects the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, the ship accompanying his own was destroyed under the weight of a massive chain that spanned the harbour entrance. Nevertheless, Harald and his men managed to enter the strait and navigate north into the Black Sea, heading for Kiev. Harald arrived back in Kiev in late 1042 and shortly afterwards married Elisive, the daughter of Prince Yaroslav, who was now happy for Harald to take her hand in marriage after he had established himself as a leading Norse warlord during his years in service to the Byzantines, while Elisive was a grown woman by this time. Yaroslav's willingness to countenance the marriage was significant, and perhaps indicates an awareness that Harald now had ambitions to secure a throne back in Scandinavia, as Yaroslav's other children were married to European royalty. Another possible condition of marrying Elisive may have been that Harold was a source of information on the defences of Constantinople, which were famously considered to be amongst the most formidable in the world at the time. It is perhaps no coincidence that shortly after Harold's arrival back in Kiev, Yaroslav launched an attack on the great city. Like all other Norse rulers and warlords who had attempted this in the past, Yaroslav failed to breach the city walls. There is no record of Harold having taken part in this campaign in 1043. In the summer of 1045, Harald, along with his wife, said their goodbyes to Yaroslav and the members of the royal court of Kiev and departed north for the city of Novgorod. From there they made the short overland trip to the Baltic Sea, finally arriving in Sigtuna in Sweden in late 1045 or early 1046, travelling in a ship which, according to accounts, almost sank under the weight of the gold and riches Harold was returning home with after a decade and a half in Kiev and the Mediterranean. Whilst in Sweden, Harold secured the support of his family's old ally, King Anund Jakob, whom his wife Elisive was related to. Jakob and Yaroslav being brothers-in-law. Harald also joined forces with a pretender to the Danish throne, Sweyn Estridsson, the grandson of Sweyn Forkbeard, who had been exiled from Denmark by King Magnus. An alliance was soon forged therewith, and the three figures, Harald, Jakob and Sweyn, with the goal of attacking King Magnus's territories, despite his family relationship with Harald. They soon began conducting raids on the Danish coast. However, these quickly ceased once Magnus, in 1046, offered to share the throne of Norway with Harald if, in return, he would share some of the great wealth which rumour had it he had returned to Scandinavia with. With this agreement reached, Harald began to rule half of Norway along with King Magnus. His decision proved extremely advantageous when, just months later, in 1047, Magnus died, perhaps of some disease. Harald now emerged as the undisputed King of Norway and quickly claimed the Danish throne too, even though Magnus had appointed Sweyn as his heir apparent there before his death. Consequently, Harald and Sweyn, who had only so recently been allies, went to war with one another in what would prove to be a long drawn-out conflict that lasted intermittently from 1048 to 1064. During this war, Harald sacked the vitally important Danish trade centre of Hedeby in 1049. This was one of the best protected and most populated towns in Scandinavia. He followed up his attack there with another one on the Danish city of Aarhus in 1050, during which the Holy Trinity Church was burned to the ground. In terminating his attacks on Denmark, Harold had a narrow escape, only evading capture when sailing from Jutland, when, in an attempt to escape, he lightened the cargo of his ship by throwing captured booty into the sea. When even this failed to deter Sweyn's pursuit, Harald threw his captives overboard as well, after which he and his men finally made their getaway. As well as his war against the Danes, Harald also had to contend with discontent from his own nobles in the form of the descendants of Harald Sigurdsson, who had formerly controlled most of Norway as a vassal of Denmark in the late 10th century, and whose family line was now headed by Einar Tembarskelfir. Einar had married Hakon's daughter, and after the death of King Canute, had done much to place Magnus the Good onto the Norwegian throne. Then, in an effort to deal with the powerful Einar, who was trying to raise an army around 1050, Harold offered to meet his rival at a farm near Trondheim. There, it was alleged that the two men were to discuss a resolution of their dispute. However, Harold demonstrated how ruthless he could be, as when Einar arrived with his son and heir at the meeting, Harold's men ambushed them and killed both quickly. It was also around this time that Harald secured his line when two sons, Olaf and Magnus, were born in quick succession, not through his marriage to Elisiv of Kiev, but from a separate relationship with a royal consort, Tora Torbergsdatter, that he had entered into after returning to Scandinavia. He remained married to Elisiv, and the relationship with Tora was a quasi-polygamous one in a country where pagan violations of church law remained an issue long after rulers like Harald had converted to Christianity. Now that he had fully subdued the Norwegian nobility, Harald was able to once again set about trying to enforce his claim to the Danish throne, resuming the war against Sweyn. The high point of this conflict came in 1062 when the two sides clashed at the naval Battle of Nisa. Here, on the Nisan River, near the modern-day Swedish city of Halmstad, on the 9th of August, both sides would employ their longships. It was with a fleet comprised of as many as 300 of these iconic vessels that Harold arrived at the Nisan River. However, when he did so, Sweyn and his own fleet was seemingly absent from the battle site, prompting Harold to perhaps naively order many of his forces to head home, whilst retaining part of his forces to raid along the Danish coastline. Not long after, Sweyn, along with his fleet of some 300 ships which had been lying in wait in a concealed position, ordered an approach on the Norwegian forces, who they now outnumbered 2-1. In response to this sudden appearance of the Danish ships, Harold and his chief Norwegian ally Håkon Ivarsson pulled their ships together in a tight formation. This was then mirrored by Sweyn and his men until finally the two fleets joined battle in a storm of arrows, under which thousands of Vikings locked horns in hand-to-hand combat. Ultimately, much to Sweyn's despair, Harald's army was victorious, although he almost lost his life in the process, with many Danes escaping to fight another day. In the celebrations that followed, credit for the Norwegian victory was given to Håkon Iversen, who had outflanked the enemy during the fighting and caught them off guard. Despite this, the victory was soured by the fact that Sweyn had managed to flee alive after being initially captured. To Harald's displeasure, he discovered that his rival had possibly been freed by his second-in-command, Håkon, who had previously served under Sweyn's command prior to changing sides in the war. This seeming betrayal resulted in Harald banishing Håkon from Norway. As neither king had been able to secure a decisive victory in this long and bloody war, a peace treaty between both sides was agreed in 1064. In this, both sovereigns kept their respective thrones, Harald in Norway, Sweyn in Denmark, each acknowledging the legitimate right to rule of the other. This freed Harald to begin implementing some domestic reforms at home in Norway, at least to the limited extent that any central government was able to impose and implement national policies in the 11th century, given the limitations of state bureaucracies at that time. On the economic front, Harald ordered the minting of a new coinage for the country with standardized weights and measures, and also tried to exploit his long-standing connections with Sweden, the Kievan Rus, and even the Byzantine Empire to foster increased trade from the ports of Norway to places like Kiev and Constantinople. Other concerns on the home front for Harald were efforts to convert to Christianity the substantial number of Norwegians who remained wedded to the old pagan religion of their forebears. To this end, he tried to increase the number of bishops, priests and monks in Norway, inviting them to the country from abroad, while also building new churches and repairing damaged chapels across the country. Perhaps the most important policy of all pursued by Harald, though, was the development of the city of Oslo. A small settlement had existed here for some time, and his predecessor, Magnus, had patronized the further development of it, but it was seemingly Harald who played the greatest role in its early history, making the burgeoning settlement what was known as a kaupstad, a market town, through a royal grant, one strategically positioned to take advantage of trade moving between the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. Of course, there was a bloodier and more ruthless side to Harald's rule, one which was in stark contrast to Magnus. Although a child of Norwegian royalty and a Norse warlord, Harald had spent over a decade and a half absent from Scandinavia and had to impose his rule with severity at times on a country where many people did not know him and his bonds were weak. Accordingly, he often imposed his rule through harsh punishments of those who disobeyed his orders. Over time, this earned him his nickname of Hardrada, meaning stern or hard ruler. It was a name which was fitting, as the Norwegian king often imposed his rule through summary executions of those who opposed him, or by using his personal army, or herd, to exact taxes and other dues. He also increased the power of the Norwegian monarchy during his reign by enforcing a policy which stated that only the king could keep his own herd, giving Harald increased power over the lords of Norway. After solidifying his control over Norway and having accepted that Sweyn would continue to rule Denmark, Harald turned his attention in the mid-1060s to England. After the death of King Harthacnut back in 1042, when Magnus had become King of Denmark, the rule of England had reverted back into the hands of the royal house of Wessex, with Edward the Confessor succeeding to the throne. He was an Anglo-Saxon ruler, at least to the extent that we can still speak of Anglo-Saxons and Danes as distinct entities in England by this time. Such was the level of intermarriage which had occurred between the two groups over 2 centuries by the mid-11th century. Edward, for instance, might have been a member of the Anglo-Saxon Wessex line, but his mother was Emma of Normandy, a member of the royal family there, established by the Norse who conquered this part of northern France in the late 9th and early 10th century. She had also later married King Canute, so Edward's stepfather had been a Norse ruler of England, and he was descended from the Norse Normans on his mother's side. He ruled England for nearly a quarter of a century thereafter. However, a succession crisis was brewing by the mid-1060s because, much as his pseudonym, the Confessor, might suggest, Edward is understood to have been a deeply religious man and possibly took a vow of celibacy despite also marrying. Whether the union was chaste remains, of course, a matter of debate, but it certainly did not result in children or an heir to succeed Edward, nor was there a clear candidate elsewhere in his family. Harald's interest in England was first kindled when he received an invitation from the unseated Danish lord Tostig Godwinson, brother to Earl Harold Godwinson of Wessex, to help him claim back the Anglo-Saxon earldom of Northumbria, which he had been removed from the rule of owing to Tostig's violent conduct. This discontent towards Tostig boiled over in 1065 when a rebellion broke out in the north against the hated earl. King Edward responded by sending Tostig's brother, Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, northwards to negotiate with the Northumbrian rebels. Having appraised the situation there, Harold refused to support his own brother, a move which led the humiliated Tostig into exile and to request the aid of Harald Hardrada in Norway. By this time, Edward the Confessor was gravely ill, and Harald saw an opportunity not just to re-establish Tostig in Northumbria and acquire a major ally in England in the process, but also to potentially put himself in a position to succeed Edward as King of Norway, a move which would go some way to re-establishing the North Sea Empire of Canute the Great. Events were moving very quickly as 1066 dawned. On the 5th of January, Edward the Confessor died, and it was quickly revealed that, despite being a primarily Anglo-Saxon monarch, he had named Harold Godwinson, Tostig's brother, as his heir. Thus did he succeed as King Harold II of England. At the same time, Tostig had been moving between the Low Countries, Scotland and England, trying to reclaim his earldom. Upon his brother's accession, he now sent word to Harald Hardrada and spurred him on to press his claim to the throne of England. Tostig may even have travelled to Norway to Harold's court at this juncture, where the Norwegian king was impressed enough with Tostig's proposal that the two men formed an alliance and began planning their invasion of England, although some argue that Tostig did not travel to Norway, and the two men only met in person after Harold arrived to England with an invasion force in the summer of 1066. Harald Hardrada's claim to the English throne was based on an agreement between the former Danish ruler of England, King Harthacnut, and King Magnus the Good. This allegedly had stated that the last man living of the pair would inherit the other's lands and titles in totality, whereas Magnus had only acquired the throne of Denmark, and that of England had passed to Edward the Confessor on the death of Harthacnut in 1042. If true, this did mean that Hardrada had a strong claim to the English throne. However, most historians contend that this agreement had never included England, so when Harthacnut died in 1042, Edward the Confessor's succession in England had been entirely legal. It is also telling that Hardrada had never been too anxious to pursue his alleged claim to the English throne until Tostig suddenly began petitioning him to do so nearly 2 decades into Harald's reign in Norway. If Hardrada had believed that his claim to the English throne was a strong and legitimate one, surely he would have pressed it much earlier while Edward the Confessor was still alive. These issues aside, what is clear is that in the early to midsummer of 1066, Harald began preparing his forces and navy for an invasion of England. They set sail that August. It only took a few days for Harald's invasion force of a reputed 250 to 300 longships to making the passage across the North Sea. They stopped in the Shetland and Orkney Islands, two long-standing spheres of Norse control, rallying more men to Hardrada's banner as he went. These included several thousand Scottish troops. Once landed in northern England, Harald and Tostig's forces joined together in the vicinity of the River Tees near modern-day Middlesbrough, following which they began conducting raids on Scarborough and other Northumbrian towns en route to the capital of the north, the city of York. After sailing down the River Humber and disembarking at the village of Rickhall, the Norse army headed towards York, but when they came in sight of the city's walls near the modern-day village of Fulford, on the 20th of September 1066, Hardrada and his forces were confronted by a 3,000 to 4,000 strong Anglo-Saxon army under the command of Tostig's arch-enemies and two of his brother, Harold II's, closest allies, Edwin, Earl of Mercia, and Morcar, Earl of Northumbria. In preparation for the forthcoming clash of arms, one which could decide the entire fate of the war between King Harald of Norway and King Harold of England, Hardrada deployed Tostig, along with a contingent of Flemish mercenaries that he had recruited in the Low Countries, to the right of his Norwegian divisions. This meant that Tostig and his men would be fighting opposite Earl Morcar on the left side of the Anglo-Saxon forces, a shrewd move by Hardrada, who knew that Tostig would fight hard against the man who had replaced him as Earl of Northumbria. On the other side, Hardrada and his Norwegians would face off against Earl Edwin, who deployed his forces at a right angle between the River Ouse on the Saxon right and marshes on their left, meaning that Hardrada's forces could not outflank them despite occupying the high ground. Hostilities commenced when Morcar's men charged Tostig's, the latter of which struggled to contain them. In response, Harald's forces swept across the battlefield and dispatched Edwin's right wing, in turn splitting their English opponents into two factions, decimating their formation. With the English hemmed in and surrounded on three sides, they soon fell back into York, whilst Edwin and Morcar escaped unharmed. 4 days later, on the 24th of September 1066, the city capitulated and Harald took hostages of some of the leading families there to guarantee their continued obedience. News of the victory won by Hardrada and Tostig at the Battle of Fulford soon reached King Harold II, who was already on his way north from London to Yorkshire with a second army to meet Hardrada in the field. According to our accounts of these events, which quite probably exaggerated what happened, Harold and his English army apparently completed an almost 200-mile march north in only 4 days, rallying troops as he went before arriving in Tadcaster, west of York, on the 24th of September, the same day York surrendered to Hardrada. Although it is one of the most famous battles in English history, the exact site of the Battle of Stamford Bridge that now followed between King Harald and King Harold is not known for certain. It is generally believed to have been east of the River Derwent, southeast of the town now known as Stamford Bridge. It also seems that Hardrada had underestimated the size of the army which the English king had marched north with, and had left his own forces divided, with much of the host accompanying him to Stamford Bridge, but a substantial proportion of it moored at Rickwall with the fleet. This meant that he had left York undefended, culminating in King Harold and his forces reoccupying York on the morning of the 25th of September, before marching eastwards towards Hardrada's Vikings, who were encamped on the eastern bank of the River Derwent. Hardrada had been caught completely off guard by the speed with which his rival had marched northwards. It is said that after crossing the Derwent, Harold, in the hope of pacifying his brother Tostig, rode up to the Norwegian army before the battle and offered to restore Tostig to the earldom of Northumbria if he abandoned Hardrada and fought for him. Yet Tostig refused the offer, and the Battle of Stamford Bridge commenced. After forming their lines, the English and Norwegians advanced gradually and then clashed in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle. In this, the English had the better of it, as Hardrada's men had been so taken by surprise by the rapid march northwards of the English that many were not fully outfitted with their armour. Ultimately, the Norwegian lack of armour and shields cost them dearly, as the Anglo-Saxons were able to break up their enemy's line. Then, in the very thick of the fighting, Harald Hardrada was struck in the neck with an arrow and mortally wounded. He still continued to cut down his foes until, exhausted, the King of Norway was finally slain. After he fell, Tostig continued to lead their forces, but he too was soon killed as well. It was only at this juncture that some of Hardrada's additional men, led by Eystein Orri, who was betrothed to Hardrada's daughter Maria, began a counterattack, one which almost breached the English line until Orri was himself killed and his men routed. After the battle, the remaining Norsemen slipped away under the cover of darkness. They were pursued to Rickle by the victorious King Harold and his men. There they allowed Hardrada's son and successor, Olaf, to return home to Norway under the condition that he would never try to invade England again. Olaf agreed, and so the young Norwegian ruler set sail for home, along with less than a tenth of his father's original force of 10,000 men, and only 25 of the 300 ships which had arrived in England. However, while King Harold had won a major victory at Stamford Bridge, it was a Pyrrhic one. Even as Hardrada and Tostig had been launching their invasion of England from the north, another challenger for the throne of England, William, Duke of Normandy, had been preparing to land in the south of the country to press his own claim. William was a relative of Edward the Confessor on account of Edward's descent on his mother's side from the ducal house of Normandy, and so William had a strong enough claim to the throne of England, one which he bolstered by arguing that Edward had named him as his heir all the way back in 1051. Harold's march northwards, and the forces he had lost in defeating Hardrada, had cost him time and men. Thus, when he learned of the landing of William and his Normans on the southern coast just days after defeating Hardrada, it was, with a depleted and tired host, that he commenced another rapid march south. At the famous Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October 1066, King Harold II was defeated and killed. William and his Normans went on to conquer England, marking the transition from Anglo-Saxon to Norman England, with William the Conqueror as the first Norman monarch of the country. Harald Hardrada was unquestionably one of the most colourful and successful Viking or Norse warlords of the age of the Vikings. In his youth, his family experienced a series of desperate setbacks which left him as what would now be considered simply a teenager fleeing from Scandinavia and carving out a new life for himself amongst the Kievan Rus in Eastern Europe. That his fortunes were at a low ebb was seen in the refusal of Yaroslav the Wise to grant him his daughter's hand in marriage during his first years in Kiev. However, undismayed, young Harald headed for Miklagard, the great city, where he achieved fame and fortune as a leader of the Varangian Guard, battling Arabs, Muslim Berbers, and Normans from Sicily to Iraq. Returning home to Scandinavia a decade and a half after fleeing into exile with his Kievan bride, he claimed what he perceived as his birthright and became King of Norway. Thereafter, he nearly acquired the throne of Denmark too, and initiated a wide range of reforms at home in Norway. It could be said that his life ended in ignominy and defeat while trying to claim the throne of England. However, he quite possibly changed the course of history in the process. Perhaps Harold Godwinson would have been able to resist the Norman invasion of Duke William and prevent the Norman conquest of England had it not been his forces being tired and depleted in their northern campaign against Hardrada? One thing is for sure. Hardrada certainly deserves the title Adam of Bremen gave him, the Thunderbolt of the North. What do you think of Harald Hardrada? Was he a brutal and tyrannical king who only sought power and wealth? Or was he one of the last true Viking heroes? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.